I never thought I'd be starting over at 59. The day Eldric told me he was leaving, I was arranging late-blooming roses from our garden in the blue ceramic vase we'd bought on our honeymoon in Gatlinburg 30 years ago, 3 decades. Of marriage, 1 son, a lifetime of quiet compromises and shared dreams, all of it suddenly meant nothing to him. "I've fallen in love with someone else," he said, his voice steady as if he were discussing weekend plans. "Amara makes me feel alive again in ways I'd forgotten. But what happens when the man who discarded you like yesterday's newspaper suddenly needs you more than ever?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of my kitchen window, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago. I stood at the counter, hands wrapped around my favorite mug, the one Nico had made in his high school pottery class, slightly lopsided but perfect in its imperfection, and watched the birds at the feeder I'd hung from the old oak tree. Cardinals, chickadees, and the occasional blue jay that bullied the smaller birds away from the sunflower seeds. This was my morning ritual now, 6 months after Eldric moved out. Coffee at 7, birds at 7:15, shower at 7:30, and off to Riverside Elementary by 8 to unlock the library and prepare for another day of helping children discover the magic of stories. It was a routine I'd created from scratch, something that belonged entirely to me, and I found comfort in its predictability. Our house, my house now, technically, though the lawyers were still sorting through the details, sat on a quiet street in West Asheville, where the neighborhood was old enough to have character but young enough to avoid being touristy. The morning joggers were making their rounds, and Mrs. Chen next door was already in her garden, tending to the vegetables that would feed half the block come harvest time. She'd wave when she saw me at the window, and I'd wave back, both of us maintaining the pleasant fiction that nothing had changed. But everything had changed, hadn't it? The silence in the house was different now, not the comfortable quiet of a long marriage, but the hollow echo of absence. Eldric's coffee mug sat unused in the cabinet. His side of the bathroom counter stayed perpetually clean, the garage, once cluttered with his cycling gear and half-finished projects, now held only my car and the boxes I hadn't yet decided what to do with. I'd been married for 30 years. 30 years of being half of something, of making decisions as we instead, of adjusting my dreams to fit around someone else's. When I married Eldric in 1994, I'd just finished my undergraduate degree in art education and had been accepted to a graduate program in fine arts at UNC. But Eldric was starting his tech company, one of those .com dreams that seemed so promising. In the mid-90s, and he needed support. Stability, someone to handle the practical things while he chased his vision of changing the world through software. So I deferred grad school. Just for a year, we said, just until the company got off the ground. But 1 year became 2, then 5, then 10, and by the time I might have gone back, the company had failed, we had nickel, and I'd found my place as the steady one, the reliable one, the one who kept everything running smoothly while everyone else pursued their passions. The art supplies were still in the basement, packed away in plastic bins like archaeological artifacts from another life. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd go down there and lift the lid of the box that held my paints, just to remember the smell of oil and turpentine, the weight of a brush in my hand, the particular satisfaction of mixing colors. Until they were exactly right, I'd been a good painter once. Not great, maybe, but good enough that my professors had encouraged me to continue. I'd specialized in landscapes, drawn to the way light changed everything it touched. The way a single scene could look completely different depending on the time of day or the season or the weather. There was something profound about capturing a moment that would never exist again in exactly the same way. But that was a long time ago. Now I worked with children's books instead of canvases, helping 8-year-olds navigate picture books and 12-year-olds discover young adult fiction that might change their lives. It wasn't the career I'd dreamed of, but it had its rewards. There was something magical about watching a reluctant reader discover a book that spoke to them, or seeing a shy child light up when they found their place in story time, Nicole called. Every Sunday, usually while I was making dinner I wouldn't finish. He was 31 now, a chef at a farm-to-table restaurant in Portland, Oregon, with his father's dark hair and my stubborn streak. He'd been furious when Eldric left, angrier than I'd been, actually. How could he just throw away everything? He demanded during one of our calls, "How could he hurt you like this?" I hadn't known how to answer that. How do you explain to your son that love sometimes isn't enough? That people grow apart, want different things, become strangers sharing a house? I couldn't tell him that I'd seen it coming for years. The way Eldric looked at me sometimes like he was trying to remember why he'd fallen in love with me in the first place. The truth was, I'd been preparing for this moment longer than I cared to admit, not consciously, but in the way you prepare for winter without really thinking about it, stocking up on firewood, checking the furnace, buying warmer clothes. I'd been building a life that could stand on its own, piece by piece, choice by choice, without fully realizing what I was doing. There was the quilting circle I'd joined 5 years ago, a group of women who met every Thursday evening at the library to work on their projects and share stories. There was Odette, my best friend from college, who'd moved to Asheville 3 years ago to open an art gallery downtown and had been gently pushing me to pick up a paintbrush again ever since. There was the community garden where I'd started, volunteering on weekends, getting my hands dirty and watching things grow. Small things, really. Threads in a tapestry I hadn't known I was weaving. But when Eldric finally said the words I'd been expecting for months, when he finally made official what had been true for years, I found I had somewhere to stand. The phone rang, interrupting my reverie. I glanced at the caller ID, Odette. She had an uncanny ability to call exactly when I needed to hear a friendly voice. "Morning, sunshine," she said when I picked up. "How's the Fortress of Solitude treating you today?" "It's quiet," I said, which was both true and an understatement. "Good quiet, though. Peaceful, Mum." "And how's the heart? Still holding together?" This was vintage Odette, direct, caring, unwilling to let me hide behind politeness. We'd been friends since freshman year at Appalachian State, when we'd been randomly assigned as roommates and discovered we were both art majors who preferred tea to coffee and stayed up too late discussing whether art could change the world. She'd gone on to get her MFA and eventually open her gallery, while I'd taken the detour that became my life. "The heart is fine," I said. "Battered but functional. Like an old pickup truck, perfect analogy, ugly but reliable." She paused, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably making that elaborate coffee that required 17 steps and cost more than my lunch. "Listen, I've been thinking. What are your plans for this weekend?" "The usual. Laundry, grocery shopping, maybe finishing that baby quilt for my cousin's daughter." "Wrong answer. You're coming to the gallery opening Friday night. Elena Vasquez is showing her new series, and it's going to be spectacular. Plus, you need to get out of that house and remember that there's a whole world full of art and beauty, and people who appreciate both." I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with the thought of social events. "I don't know, Odette. I'm not really in a place for what? For beauty, for inspiration, for remembering who you were before. You spent 30 years being half of something else." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Imogen, honey, I love you dearly. But if you hide in that house much longer, you're going to disappear entirely." She wasn't wrong. I'd been feeling increasingly invisible lately, like I was fading around the edges. Part of it was the divorce, certainly, But part of it was something deeper, the sense that I'd spent so long being what other people needed me to be that I'd forgotten what I needed for myself. Besides, Odette continued, I want you to meet someone. Maynard Tulliver, he goes by May. He runs art therapy classes at the Unitarian Church, and he's exactly the kind of quietly interesting man you need in your life right now. I'm not ready. For friendship, for someone who shares your interests. I'm not talking about romance, though stranger things have happened. I'm talking about connection, community, the kind of people who will see you for who you are, not who you've been expected to be. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the empty spaces where Eldric's things used to be the cookbook he'd bought but never used. The coffee grinder that only he operated because he claimed I never got the settings right. The small daily evidence of a shared life, now gone. But there were other things too, the art books I'd started buying again, slowly building a collection of contemporary landscape painters whose work made my fingers itch for brushes. The easel I'd ordered online last month, but hadn't yet assembled, still in its box in the spare bedroom like a promise I wasn't quite ready to make to myself. The sketch pad I'd been carrying in my purse, just in case inspiration struck. Maybe Odette was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for my life to start again and actually start it. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days when Eldric showed up at my door. I was in the living room, working on a quilt pattern, spread across the coffee table, something geometric and soothing that required enough concentration to keep my mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. The doorbell rang just after 7 in the evening, an odd time for visitors, and when I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. He stood on my front porch looking smaller somehow, rain dripping from his jacket, his usually perfectly styled hair plastered to his head. For 30 years, I'd opened this door to him countless times, coming home from work, returning from business trips, arriving late from dinners with clients. But this was different. This was my door now, my house, my life he was interrupting. I opened it anyway, because old habits die hard, and because despite everything, seeing him soaked and miserable triggered the caretaking instincts I'd spent 3 decades developing. Imogen, he said, and his voice was rough around the edges. Can I come in? We need to talk. I stepped aside without a word, watching as he dripped water onto the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself. He looked around the living room like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in the changes I'd made since he left. The bookshelf I'd rearranged to hold my art books instead of his technical manuals. The wall where I'd hung some of my old college paintings, the ones I'd found in the basement storage. The coffee table covered with fabric squares and quilting patterns instead of his industry magazines. The place looks good, he said, shrugging out of his jacket. Different, but good, thank you. I remained standing, arms crossed, not offering him a seat or a towel or any of the small courtesies I would have automatically extended 6 months ago. What do you want, Eldric? He ran his hand through his wet hair, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times when he was nervous or trying to find the right words. I need to ask you for something. A favour. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, he'd stood in this same room and told me our marriage was over, that he'd found someone who made him feel alive again, that he needed to follow his heart before it was too late. Now he was back, asking for favours. What kind of favour? I kept my voice neutral, but my heart was racing. I need surgery, he said, the words coming out in a rush. My cardiologist found some blockages, triple bypass, probably. It's not immediately life-threatening, but it needs to happen soon. I felt the floor shift slightly beneath my feet. Despite everything, despite the hurt and anger and the slow, painful process of rebuilding my life without him, he was still the father of my son, still someone I'd loved for the better part of my adult life. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. That must be frightening. It is. He sat down heavily on the couch, uninvited, and I noticed how tired he looked. There were new lines around his eyes, and his skin had a greyish cast that worried me. The thing is, Amara's insurance through her wellness coaching business doesn't cover much, and mine through the startup is basically catastrophic coverage only. But yours through the school district ... The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I stared at him, processing what he was asking, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. You want me to put you back on my insurance, I said slowly, temporarily, just for the surgery and recovery. I know it's a lot to ask, and I know things between us are complicated, but are complicated. I repeated the word like I was trying to understand a foreign language. That's what you call it when you leave your wife of 30 years for a woman young enough to be your daughter. Imogen, please, I'm not asking for anything else. I'm not asking for forgiveness or another chance or just my insurance. Yes, I walked to the window and stared out at the rain, watching it pool in the garden beds where I'd planted daffodils last fall. They'd be coming up soon, pushing through the cold earth towards sunlight, the way living things do when they're ready to grow. Behind me, I could hear Eldric breathing, waiting for my answer. Does Amara know you're here? I asked without turning around. There was a long pause. She knows I'm exploring options. Options. Another word that felt loaded with meaning. I was. An option now, a backup plan, a solution to a problem his new life couldn't solve. And what does she think about her husband asking his ex-wife for help? We're not actually married yet, he said quietly. We've been talking about it, but with everything that's happened ... I turned around to face him then, studying the man I'd lived with for so long I could predict his moods by the way he held his shoulders, the way he drummed his fingers when he was thinking, the particular expression he got when he was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said. You left me because you found someone who made you feel alive again. Someone younger, more exciting, someone who represented all the possibilities you felt you were missing. But now that you need something practical, something stable, something that requires the kind of long-term commitment and shared resources that come with marriage, now you're back here, asking me to solve your problem. It's not like that, or what's it like, then? He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, maybe several mistakes. But right now, I'm just trying to survive. And there it was, the admission I'd been waiting for without realizing it. Not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement that his grand gesture of following his heart had consequences he hadn't considered, that real life had a way of intruding on romantic fantasies. I thought about the quilt I'd been working on when he rang the doorbell. It was supposed to be our anniversary quilt, a surprise I'd been planning for months before he left. 30 squares representing 30 years of marriage, each one carefully chosen to represent a memory, a milestone, a moment of shared joy. I'd been working on it in secret, staying up late to hand-stitch the intricate patterns, imagining his face when I gave it to him on our anniversary in September. September had come and gone. He'd been with Amara by then, probably not even remembering that it would have been our 30th. The quilt was still upstairs in the spare bedroom, unfinished, a monument to my own naive hope that love could overcome anything if you just worked hard enough at it. I need time to think about this, I said, finally. Relief flooded his face. Of course, I understand. Thank you for even considering it. I didn't say I was considering it. I said I needed time to think. The distinction seemed to surprise him. In the old days, my saying I needed time to think was usually just a polite way of saying yes, while allowing myself to feel like I'd maintained some agency in the decision. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been arranging roses in a blue ceramic vase 6 months ago. That woman would have already been reaching for the insurance forms, would have been mentally calculating how to make it work, would have been prioritizing his needs over her own hurt feelings. This woman was tired. Tired of being the one who always accommodated, always understood, always made things easier for everyone else. How long do you have? I asked. Before the surgery. I mean, a few weeks, maybe a month. The cardiologist wants to get it scheduled soon. Then you'll have your answer soon. I walked to the front door and held it open, a clear signal that our conversation was over. He gathered his jacket and headed toward the door, pausing when he reached me. Imogen, he said. And for a moment he looked like the man I've fallen in love with 30 years ago, vulnerable, uncertain, hoping for grace he wasn't sure he deserved. I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I also know that underneath all of that hurt, you're still the kindest person I've ever known. And I'm hoping ... you're hoping I'll save you, I said. The way I always have. He didn't deny it. He simply nodded and walked out into the rain, leaving me standing in my doorway, watching him drive away in the car I'd helped him buy, toward the life I'd helped him afford to leave me for. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of what he'd asked settling around me like a heavy coat. In the living room, my quilt squares were still spread across the coffee table, waiting for me to decide what pattern they should form, what story they should tell. For 30 years, I'd been the supporting character in other people's stories. The devoted wife who put her dreams on hold. The understanding mother who never complained about the sacrifices. The reliable friend who was always available when needed. I'd worn those roles like comfortable old clothes, so familiar I'd forgotten they were costumes rather than my actual skin. But maybe it was time for a different story. Maybe it was time to be the protagonist of my own life, to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. I gathered up the quilt squares and carried them upstairs to the spare bedroom, where I placed them next to the unfinished anniversary quilt. Then I stood there for a long time, looking at all those carefully stitched pieces, all that work and hope and love poured into something that would never serve its intended purpose. But maybe that didn't mean it was worthless. Maybe it just meant it was time to imagine a new purpose, a new pattern, a new story entirely. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean for whatever was coming next. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 instead of my usual 6:45, my mind churning with thoughts I couldn't quite organize. Coffee didn't help. Neither did my usual morning ritual of watching the birds, who seemed unusually agitated, darting away from the feeder as if they sensed my unsettled mood. I arrived at Riverside Elementary an hour earlier than necessary, grateful for the quiet hallways and the familiar smell of floor wax and copy paper. The library was my sanctuary, a place where everything had its proper place, and every problem had a solution if you just knew where to look for it. I unlocked the doors and turned on the lights, illuminating rows of picture books and chapter books, reference materials and computers. The reading corner with its colourful beanbag chairs where I held story time every Tuesday and Thursday. This was where I'd built my life after art, where I'd found purpose in helping other people discover magic instead of creating it myself. 20-3 years I'd been the librarian at Riverside Elementary. I'd watched children grow from picture books to young adult novels, had recommended countless stories to countless readers, had been the safe adult some kids could talk to when home was complicated. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it had been a good life, meaningful in ways I hadn't expected when I'd first taken the job as a temporary solution. The first students wouldn't arrive for another hour, but I found myself pulling books from the shelves anyway, not really sure what I was looking for until I found it. A warm copy of A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf that someone had donated to our adult collection. I'd read it years ago, but I flipped through it now, looking for the passage I remembered about women needing space and money and independence to create. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. I read aloud to the empty library. But what about painting? What about living? What about making choices that served your own soul instead of everyone else's needs? Talking to yourself now, Imogen? I looked up to find Clara Martinez, the school's counselor, standing in the doorway. With her coffee mug and the slightly amused expression she wore when she was trying to gauge whether someone needed professional help or just a friend. Just thinking out loud, I said, closing the book. You're here early. IEP meeting at 7:30 with the Hender sons. You? Couldn't sleep. I shelved the wolf book and turned to face her fully. Clara was one of the few people at school who knew about my divorce, and she'd been quietly supportive without being intrusive, a skill that served her well in her profession. Want to talk about it? I hesitated. Clara was a good listener. But what Eldric had asked me felt too big, too complicated to explain in the 20 minutes before the school day began. Maybe later, I said, after school. Sure, we could grab dinner at that new place on Haywood. My treat. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. That's what friends do. The word friends hit me unexpectedly hard. When had I last had friends who weren't connected to Eldric somehow? The quilting circle, yes, but most of my social life for the past 30 years had revolved around couples we knew, business associates of his, neighbours we'd befriended together. The divorce had shown me how many of my relationships had been circumstantial rather than chosen. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. The school day passed in its usual rhythm of story times and book checkouts, helping third graders find books about dinosaurs and convincing fifth graders that reading could be fun if you found the right story. But underneath the familiar routine, Eldric's request kept circling in my mind like a song you can't stop humming. During lunch, I called Nicole in Portland. Mom. His voice was warm but concerned. I didn't usually call during his prep time at the restaurant. Everything okay? Your father came to see me last night. There was a long pause. Shit, sorry, shoot. What did he want? I told him about the surgery, the insurance, the favor that felt like so much more than a favor. Nicole listened without interrupting, the way he'd learned to do during the difficult months after the separation, when I'd needed someone to process my feelings with, but hadn't wanted to burden him with details. So, what are you going to do? He asked when I finished. I don't know. Part of me thinks it's just health insurance. It's not like I'm taking him back or anything. But another part of me feels like I struggle to find the words. Like if I do this, I'm saying it's okay. What he did, how he left, the way he's lived his life. Like I'm the safety net he can always fall back on when his choices don't work out. Have you always been his safety net? The question surprised me with its directness. What do you mean? I mean, when I was growing up, it always seemed like Dad was the one with the big dreams and you were the one who made sure everything actually worked. Like when his first company failed and you picked up extra tutoring to help pay the bills. Or when he wanted to go back to school for his MBA and you handled all the household stuff so he could focus on studying. Or when he decided to start the cycling hobby and suddenly we had a garage full of expensive bikes while you were driving that old Honda with the broken air conditioning. I'd never thought about it that way, but he wasn't wrong. I'd always been the practical one, the one who handled details and logistics while Eldric pursued his visions. I'd told myself it was partnership, that we each contributed what we were good at. But maybe what I'd been good at was making his life easier, while mine got smaller. I just don't want you to feel like you have to save him again, Nicole continued. You've been doing that your whole marriage. Maybe it's time to let him figure things out for himself. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the school parking lot for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. When had I started believing that my job was to make other people's lives work? When had I become so comfortable being the supporting cast that I'd forgotten how to be the star of my own story? Dinner with Clara was exactly what I needed: good food, easy conversation, and the chance to talk through the situation with someone who understood human psychology but didn't have a personal stake in the outcome. It sounds like you're feeling guilty about the idea of saying no, Clara said over her salmon and my vegetarian pasta. Like you think withholding help makes you a bad person, doesn't it? Does it? Let's think about this differently. If a friend of yours came to you with this situation, if someone had left them for another person and then came back asking for a major favor, what would you tell them? I considered this. I'd probably tell them they don't owe their ex anything, and that saying yes might set a precedent that could complicate their healing process. Mum. So why is it different when it's you? Because I struggle with the answer. Because I'm not used to putting my own needs first. Because I was raised to be helpful and accommodating. Because for 30 years, making Eldric's life easier was how I showed love. And how did he show love? The question hung in the air between us. How would Eldric shown love? With words, sometimes. With gifts on birthdays and anniversaries. With grand gestures when he was feeling romantic. But when it came to the daily work of love, the kind that required sacrifice and compromise and putting someone else's needs ahead of your own, that had mostly been my department. I think I've been confusing love with service, I said slowly. That's not uncommon, especially for women of our generation. We were taught that taking care of others was our highest calling. But love should be reciprocal, it should involve both. People making each other's lives better, not one person constantly accommodating the other. When I got home that night, I found Odette sitting on my front porch swing, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses on the small table beside her. I hope you don't mind, she said as I approached. I used the spare key you gave me. I brought reinforcements. She held up the wine bottle. And I'm not leaving until you tell me what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost. I told her about Eldric's visit, about the surgery and the insurance and the impossible position he'd put me in. Odette listened, with increasing indignation, her artist temperament making her more visibly angry on my behalf than I'd been able to be for myself. The audacity, she said when I finished. The absolute unmitigated gall of that man. He leaves you for a younger woman and then has the nerve to come crawling back when he needs something practical, something stable, something that requires actual commitment instead of just romantic feelings. I know it sounds bad when you put it like that. It doesn't sound bad, honey. It is bad. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that's kept you stuck for 30 years. What do you mean? Asterisk. I mean he's trained you to believe that your worth comes from how useful you are to other people. That love means always saying yes, always accommodating, always being the bigger person who makes sacrifices for the greater good. But that's not love. Imogen, that's exploitation wrapped up in pretty words. We sat in silence for a while, sipping wine and listening to the evening sounds of the neighborhood. A dog barking somewhere. The distant sound of traffic on Patton Avenue, the wind. Chimes on Mrs. Chen's porch creating their own quiet music. What would happen if you said no? Odette asked finally. He'd have to find another way to pay for the surgery. Maybe Amara would marry him for the insurance benefits. Maybe he'd have to take out loans or set up a payment plan or ask family for help. In other words, he'd have to handle his own problems like an adult, I suppose. And what would happen if you said yes? I thought about it carefully. He'd get the surgery he needs. I'd feel good about helping someone in a medical crisis. But I'd also be sending the message that I'm available whenever he needs something. That leaving me doesn't have real consequences. That I'll always be here to fix whatever problems his choices create. And how does that serve your own healing? Process it doesn't. Odette reached over and squeezed my hand. You know what you need to do. You've known since the moment he asked. You're just afraid of being the kind of person who says no to someone in need. I've never been that person. Maybe it's time to try. The quilting circle met every Thursday evening in the library's community room, and this week I needed their wisdom more than their company, though I cherished both. I arrived early to set up the folding tables and arrange the good lighting, tasks that had become as automatic as breathing over the past 5 years. Grace Holloway was the first to arrive. As always, carrying her current project in a battered sewing basket that had belonged to her grandmother. At 78, she was the unofficial leader of our group, with fingers still nimble enough to create intricate patterns and a mind sharp enough to offer advice that cut straight to the heart of any problem. "You look troubled, dear," she said, spreading her hexagon quilt pieces across the table. "Man troubles. How did you know?" 30 years of marriage, 5 years of widowhood, and more life experience than I sometimes care to remember. Plus, you've got that particular expression women get when a man has asked them for something unreasonable. The others filtered in gradually. Dolores Chen, Mrs. Chen from next door, who quilted with the same precision she brought to her garden. Sarah Williams, a nurse practitioner who'd raised for children and buried to husbands. And Betty Porter, the newest member, a retired teacher who'd moved to Asheville to be closer to her grandchildren. I waited until everyone was settled with their projects before sharing Eldric's request. These women had been my confidants through the separation, offering practical advice seasoned with the kind of blunt wisdom that only comes from having lived through multiple decades of men making poor decisions. "Well," said Dolores after I finished, her needle moving steadily through an intricate star pattern. "That's quite a situation." "Quite a nerve. More like it," added Sarah. "I've seen this before in my practice, men who think their ex-wives exist to bail them out of whatever mess their new lives create. But it is a health matter," Betty pointed out gently. "Heart surgery isn't exactly optional. Neither is taking responsibility for your choices," Grace said firmly. "Imogen, let me ask you something. During your marriage, how often did you sacrifice what you wanted to help Eldric get what he needed?" I thought about the question while my hands automatically sorted fabric scraps by color, a meditative task that helped me think. "Often," I admitted. "Most of the time, really, it seemed natural." "I thought that's what marriage meant. And how often did he make similar sacrifices for you?" The silence stretched long enough for me to complete an entire scene before I answered. Not as often, or never." Grace's voice was gentle, but insistent. "I can't think of any specific examples," I said quietly. Sarah looked up from her needlework. "In my experience, people who consistently ask for sacrifices from others without offering them in return aren't asking for help. They're asking for enablement. But what if he really needs this?" I asked, "What if something happens to him and I could have prevented it?" "Honey," Dolores said, "you can't prevent anything. You can only choose how to respond to what's already happening. And what's happening is that a man who chose to leave his marriage is now asking his ex-wife to solve a problem his new relationship can't handle." Grace set down her needle and looked at me directly. "Imogen, do you know why I married my Harold?" I shook my head. Grace rarely talked about her late husband beyond mentioning that he'd been a good man who died too young. "Because he was the first man I'd ever met who made my life easier instead of harder. My daddy was a charmer who spent money we didn't have and left my mama to figure out how to keep food on the table. My first boyfriend was handsome as sin but expected me to do all the emotional work in the relationship. But Harold noticed when I was tired and offered to cook dinner. Harold remembered what I was worried about and asked how things turned out. Harold made me feel like my needs mattered as much as his." She picked up her needle again, but her eyes stayed on me. "That's what love looks like, dear, not grand gestures and passionate speeches, but daily choices to make each other's lives better. Now, you tell me, in 30 years of marriage, did Eldric make your life easier or harder?" I thought about the question while the other women worked quietly, giving me space to process. "Harder," I realized. not intentionally, but consistently. His dreams had required my stability. His passions had needed my practicality. His ambitions had demanded my sacrifices. Even his emotional needs had often taken precedence over mine. I'd been the one to manage his stress, soothe his disappointments, celebrate his victories. Harder, I said finally. Almost always harder. Then why? Grace asked. Do you think? You owe him this. The question hit like a physical blow, making me understand something I'd been avoiding. I didn't owe Eldric anything. Not loyalty, not sacrifice, not the kind of automatic accommodation I'd provided for 30 years. I'd been operating from old programming, old beliefs about what good wives do and how good women behave, because I've spent so long being the person who fixes things that I don't know how to be anything else. I admitted. Betty reached across the table and patted my hand. Learning new ways of being takes practice, she said, like quilting. The first few stitches are always crooked, but eventually, your hands remember the right rhythm. What would the right rhythm look like in this situation? I asked. You tell us, Sarah said. If you could respond to Eldric's request in a way that honored your own needs and boundaries, what would that look like? I thought about it while my hands worked automatically, piecing together squares for a lap quilt I'd been planning to donate to the Children's Hospital. I think I'd tell him no, I said slowly. I'd tell him that I'm sorry he's facing a health crisis, but that solving his problems isn't my responsibility anymore. That he made choices that led him away from our shared resources, and now he needs to figure out how to handle the consequences of those choices. And how does that feel when you imagine saying it? Grace asked, terrifying and guilty. But also ... I paused, searching for the right word. Free, like I'm finally standing up for myself instead of just going along with whatever other people expect from me. Dolores nodded approvingly. That's the feeling you want to pay attention to. The terror and guilt are just old habits trying to keep you small. The freedom is your true self trying to emerge. We worked in companionable silence for a while, each woman lost in her own project and thoughts. There was something deeply soothing about the rhythm of needlework, the way colours and patterns came together to create something beautiful and useful. It reminded me of painting, actually the meditative focus, the gradual emergence of something greater than the sum of its parts. Imogen, Grace said as we were cleaning up at the end of the evening, have you given any more thought to Odette's suggestion about picking up painting again? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some thought. I bought an easel last month, but I haven't assembled it yet. What's stopping? You fear, mostly, fear that I'm not good enough anymore, that I've lost whatever talent I had. Fear that I'll start something I can't finish, like always, or fear that you'll discover you're better than you thought and have to restructure your whole life around that truth, Sarah suggested. The comment stayed with me as I drove home through the quiet streets of West Asheville. What if I was afraid not of failure, but of success? What if the reason I kept my art supplies packed away wasn't because I'd lost interest, but because I was afraid of what I might create if I gave myself permission to try? At home, I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, researching health insurance options for people in Eldric's situation. Not because I was planning to help him, but because I wanted to understand what alternatives existed. What I found was encouraging there were payment plans, medical loans, charity programs for people facing unexpected health crises. None of it would be as convenient as being on my insurance, but all of it was possible. He had options. He'd always had options. He had just gotten used to having me solve his problems for him. I thought about the recipe box that had belonged to my grandmother, filled with handwritten cards for casseroles and cakes, comfort foods meant to nourish families through life's challenges. For years, I'd used those recipes to feed Eldric, to celebrate his successes and comfort his disappointments. I'd measured my worth by how well I could anticipate and meet his needs, but maybe it was time to cook for myself. Maybe it was time to nourish my own dreams instead of everyone else's. I pulled out my phone and sent Odette a text. "Want to help me assemble an easel this weekend?" Her response came immediately. "Finally, yes, and we're going to the art supply store afterward. It's time to get your hands dirty again," literally. Then I opened my laptop and started typing an email to Eldric. It took me 3 drafts to get the tone right, firm but not cruel, clear but not harsh. In the end, I kept it simple. "Eldric, I've given your request careful consideration, and I've decided that I won't be able to add you to my insurance. I understand this creates challenges for you, but I believe you'll find other ways to handle this situation. I wish you well with your surgery and recovery. Imogen." I stared at the email for a long time before hitting send, my finger hovering over the button like it was connected to a bomb. But when I finally pressed it, what I felt wasn't explosion, it was relief. Deep, clean relief, like setting down a heavy suitcase you'd been carrying for miles. For the first time in months, I slept soundly through the night. 3 days after I sent the email to Eldric, Amara showed up at my workplace. I was helping a 2nd grader find books about horses when Patricia, our school secretary, appeared in the library doorway with an expression that suggested I had a visitor I might not want to see. "There's a young woman here to see you," she said carefully. "Says it's about a personal matter." "She's waiting in the main office." I felt my stomach clench. "Did she give you her name?" "Amara Quinn." So this was how it was going to be, I'd said no to Eldric, and now he was sending his girlfriend to make his case for him. The old me would have been mortified by the public nature of this confrontation, worried about what my colleagues might think. But the new me, the one who was slowly learning to put her own needs first, was mostly curious about what Amara thought. She could accomplish that Eldric couldn't. "Could you watch the library for 10 minutes? I asked Patricia. "And if this takes longer than that, please call Clara Martinez." Amara was sitting in one of the plastic chairs outside the principal's office, and my first thought was how young she looked. Not just younger than me I'd expected that, but genuinely young. The kind of young that still believed love could conquer any practical problem. She was petite and blonde, dressed in the carefully casual style of someone who'd put significant thought into looking like she hadn't put any thought into her appearance. "Mrs. Vale," she stood when she saw me, extending her hand with a nervous smile. "I'm Amara. Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't agree to see you," I said calmly. "But I'm here. What can I do for you?" Her smile faltered slightly. "I was hoping we could talk somewhere private about Eldric's situation." "We can talk here," I said, gesturing to the chairs. The main office was relatively quiet. Most business was conducted during lunch or after school, but it wasn't private, which was exactly why I'd chosen it. I had no intention of getting drawn into an intimate conversation with my husband's girlfriend. "Oh, okay." She sat back down, and I took the chair across from her, maintaining a polite but distant expression. "I wanted to thank you for considering Eldric's request about the insurance. I know it can't have been easy. I did consider it," I said, "and I decided not to help. If that's why you're here, you've wasted a trip. But maybe if I explain the situation, I understand the situation perfectly. Eldric needs surgery. You can't provide the insurance coverage he needs, and he thought I might be willing to solve that problem for him. I'm not." Amara's composure cracked slightly. "But you're still his wife." "No, I'm not. We're separated and in the process of divorcing. That means he's no longer my responsibility." But morally and morally, I felt a flash of anger that surprised me with its intensity. "Let's talk about morality, Amara. Is it moral to leave your wife of 30 years for someone else and then expect her to bail you out when your new life doesn't provide what you need?" Is it moral to send your girlfriend to pressure your ex-wife? When she's already given you an answer, tears welled up in Amara's eyes, and for a moment I felt the familiar urge to comfort her, to make this easier for everyone involved. But I pushed that impulse down. This wasn't my problem to solve or my emotion to manage. I know how this looks, she said. But you don't understand what Eldric and I have. It's not some midlife crisis fling. We're in love, real, deep, soul connection love. The kind most people never find. I studied her face, taking in the earnest conviction, the romantic certainty that what she was experiencing was unique and special. I remembered feeling that way about Eldric myself, 30 years ago. I remembered believing that love was enough to overcome any obstacle, that two people who were meant to be together could handle anything life threw at them. How old are you, Amara? The question seemed to catch her off guard. 31. Why? When I was 31, I believed love could conquer anything too. I believed that if you loved someone enough, sacrificed enough, accommodated enough, everything would work out perfectly. And it didn't. It worked out exactly the way it was designed to work out. I became smaller and smaller until I was just a support system for someone else's dreams. And when I was no longer useful in that role, I was discarded. Amara flinched at the harsh word, but I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to be accurate. That's not what happened, she protested. Eldric didn't leave you because you weren't useful. He left because he realized he wasn't happy. And why wasn't he happy? I don't know. Maybe you just grew apart. Maybe you wanted different things. We grew apart because I spent 30 years making his happiness my responsibility while he never once considered making mine his. We wanted different things because I learned to want whatever he wanted. And he never learned to want anything for me. I leaned forward slightly, my voice gentle but firm. Amara, I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you this because you're about to marry a man who has spent his entire adult life expecting women to solve his problems for him. Right now, you think you're different because the problems you're solving feel romantic instead of practical. But eventually, the romance fades and what you're left with is the pattern. You're wrong, she said. But her voice lacked conviction. What Eldric and I have is different. Maybe it is. I hope for your sake that it is. But if it's really different, then you should be able to handle this surgery situation without needing help from his ex-wife. Amara was quiet for a long moment, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. When she spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. I don't know how to handle it. My insurance is terrible, and I don't have savings for something like this. Eldric's startup isn't profitable yet, and he spent most of his divorce settlement on our apartment and the engagement ring. And there it was, the practical reality underneath the romantic fantasy. They were in love, yes, but love didn't pay medical bills. Love didn't provide health insurance. Love didn't solve the fundamental problem of two people who'd structured their relationship around passion rather than partnership. Those are real problems, I said. But they're not my problems to solve, so you're just going to let him suffer. Maybe even die. The manipulation was clumsy, but effective. It hit the target of my deepest fear, that saying no made me a bad person. But I'd been preparing for this moment in therapy sessions with Clara, in conversations with the quilting circle, in long nights of questioning everything I'd believed about my role in other people's lives. I'm not letting him do anything, I said calmly. I'm allowing him to handle his own life like the adult he is. There are other options: payment plans, medical loans, family assistance, even charity programs. They're not as convenient as using my insurance, but they exist. But why make things harder when you could make them easier? Because making things easier for Eldric has been my job for 30 years, and I'm retiring from that position. The words came out more clearly than I'd expected, and I realized I meant them completely. I was retiring from the job of managing other people's problems, anticipating their needs, sacrificing my well-being for their convenience. It had been a long career, but it was over. Amara stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. I don't understand how you can be so cold about this. I'm not cold. I'm boundaried. There's a difference. But he's the father of your son. Yes, he is. And if Nickel ever needs my help, I'll be there for him without question. But Eldric forfeited his claim on my automatic support when he chose to end our marriage. What if I promised that this would be the only time we'd ever ask for anything? I almost smiled at that. The same promise Eldric had been making for 30 years whenever he needed something that required my sacrifice. Just this once, just until things get settled. Just until the business takes off, just until the economy improves. Just this one time, Amara, I said gently, you're asking me to betray myself to make your life easier. And the fact that you can't see why that's problematic tells me everything I need to know about the dynamic you and Eldric have created. She sat back in her chair, looking defeated. So that's it. You're just going to say no and walk away. I'm going to say no and walk toward the life I've been putting on hold for 3 decades. As I stood to leave, Amara grabbed my arm. Wait, what if? What if I could offer you something in exchange? Like what? I don't know. Money's work. I could clean your house or do your grocery shopping or Amara. Stop. My voice was sharper than I'd intended, but her desperation was painful to watch. You're offering to be my servant in exchange for helping your boyfriend. Do you hear how that sounds? She dropped her hand, looking stricken. I just don't know what else to do. You figure it out. Together. Like adults in a committed relationship do. I walked back to my library, leaving her sitting in the plastic chair, crying quietly in the fluorescent light of the school's main office. Part of me wanted to go back, to comfort her, to find some compromise that would make everyone happy. But that part of me had caused enough trouble already. That evening, I called Nickel and told him about Amara's visit. Jesus, Mum, she actually came to your work. She did, and it clarified something for me. This isn't really about the surgery or the insurance. It's about whether I'm going to spend the rest of my life being everyone else's solution to their problems, and I'm not. I spent 30 years being Eldric's safety net. I'm not going to spend the next 30 being his girlfriend's. There was a long pause before Nickel spoke again. I'm proud of you, Mom. I know that probably sounds weird coming from your son, but I am. You deserve to have a life that's about what you want, not what everyone else needs from you. After we hung up, I went to the spare bedroom and looked at the unassembled easel leaning against the wall. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow, Odette and I would put it together, and I would buy paints and brushes and canvas. I would start creating. Something instead of just fixing things. It was time to be the artist of my own life instead of the supporting character in everyone else's. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made Asheville feel like the most beautiful place on earth. I was finishing my coffee when Odette knocked on my door, arriving with her usual enthusiasm and a toolbox that looked like it had survived several decades of ambitious projects, ready to build yourself an art studio. She asked, hefting the toolbox with a grin, ready as I'll ever be. We carried the easel box upstairs to what had been Eldric's home office and was now becoming my art space. The room had good northern light and enough space for both the easel and a small table for supplies. I'd already moved out Eldric's desk and filing cabinets, leaving behind only the built-in bookshelves that I was slowly filling with art books instead of business journals. You know, Odette said as we unpacked the easel pieces. I've been waiting 5 years for this moment, since you moved to Asheville, since college, actually. Remember junior year when you were working on that landscape series? The ones of the Blue Ridge in different seasons. I did remember. It had been my most ambitious project, a dozen paintings that captured the same mountain vista through the changing year. My professor had called them promising and suggested I consider graduate school. I'd been so proud of them that I'd hung them in our tiny apartment, dreaming of gallery shows and artist residencies. I remember you were so happy when you were painting. Not just satisfied or content, but genuinely lit up from the inside. I always wondered what would have happened if you'd kept going. I guess we're about to find out. Assembling the easel was more complicated than either of us had expected, involving numerous small screws and a confusing diagram that seemed to assume we already knew what we were doing. But there was something meditative about the process, the careful attention to detail, the gradual emergence of something functional from a pile of wood and hardware. So, Odette said, holding a support brace in place while I tightened a bolt. Any word from Eldric since you sent the email? Nothing from him directly. But Amara came to see me at work yesterday. Odette's hands stilled. She what now? I told her about the conversation, watching her expression grow increasingly incredulous as I described Amara's attempts to convince me to change my mind. The audacity, Odette muttered. The absolute, unmitigated audacity. She comes to your workplace to pressure you into helping her boyfriend after he left you for her. I think she genuinely believes she's fighting for true love. True love doesn't ask other people to sacrifice for its convenience. We worked in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The easel was taking shape now, starting to look like the tool it was meant to be rather than a puzzle we were trying to solve. Can I ask you something? Odette said eventually. Of course. Why didn't you ever paint while you were married? I know you were busy with work and family and all the things that fill up a life. But you could have found time if it was really important to you. It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself as I prepared to pick up a brush again. I think I was afraid, I said slowly. Of what? Of being good at it. Of discovering that I'd given up something important for something that turned out to be less important. Of having to choose between my art and my marriage and making the wrong choice. And now I don't have to choose. My marriage is over, and my art is whatever I make it. We finished the easel just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, stepping back to admire our handiwork. It stood in the center of the room like a promise, like a door opening onto possibilities I'd almost forgotten existed. It's beautiful, I said, running my hand along the smooth wood. It's yours, Odette replied. That's what makes it beautiful. That evening, I called the quilting circle and asked if they'd like to come over for dinner on Sunday. I had something I wanted to show them, I said, and something I wanted to ask them about. Grace arrived first, as always, carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous cornbread. The others followed in short order, each bringing something to share, turning my kitchen into a buffet of comfort food and friendship. After dinner, I led them upstairs to see the easel. Well, said Grace, circling the easel like she was evaluating a prize horse. Look who's finally ready to stop talking about painting and start doing it. I haven't actually started yet, I said. I still need to buy supplies. What are you going to paint first? Asked Betty. I don't know. I've been thinking about landscapes again, but maybe I should start with something simpler, still lifes. Maybe, or portraits, suggested Sarah. There's something powerful about looking closely at faces, seeing what's really there instead of what you expect to see. Dolores was examining the easel's adjustable features with her engineer's eye for practical details. This is well made, she said approvingly. It'll last you decades if you take care of it. I hope I'll be painting for decades. Oh, you will, Grace said with the certainty of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize important moments when they happened. This isn't just about art, dear. This is about reclaiming yourself. We talked until late, discussing everything from color theory to brush types to the best local stores for art supplies. But underneath the practical conversation was something deeper, the sense that we were witnessing a transformation. That the woman who'd been hiding inside the devoted wife was finally ready to emerge. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Nicole. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and you're probably not going to like it." My stomach clenched. "What's wrong?" Dad called me last night. "About the insurance situation." "Oh, Nicole, I'm sorry he dragged you into this." "He didn't exactly drag me. He asked if I could talk to you, and I told him I thought you were making the right decision. But he also told me something that I think you should know." "What?" "He's been lying to you about the urgency of the surgery. His cardiologist recommended it, yes, but it's not emergency level urgent. He could wait several months if he needed to, maybe longer. He's been making it sound like he'll die without immediate surgery, but that's not what the doctor actually said." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even after everything, Eldric was manipulating the situation to try to get what he wanted. "How do you know this?" I asked him directly. I told him I was worried about you feeling guilty if something happened to him, and I wanted to know exactly what the medical situation was. He got defensive and eventually admitted that while the surgery is necessary, it's not immediately life-threatening. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing this new information. The guilt I'd been carrying, the fear that saying no might cost Eldric his life, had been based on a lie. He'd let me believe the situation was more dire than it was because he thought fear would motivate me to help him. It was such a perfectly Eldric thing to do. Not technically lying, but shading the truth to serve his purposes, managing the information to get the outcome he wanted. The same approach he'd used throughout our marriage, whenever he needed me to accommodate his latest plan or dream or crisis. The realization didn't make me angry so much as tired. Tired of being manipulated, tired of having my emotions used against me, tired of being seen as a resource to be managed rather than a person whose feelings mattered. That afternoon, I drove to the art supply store downtown, a cramped, cluttered space that smelled like paint and possibility. I spent an hour choosing brushes, testing their weight and flexibility, remembering the feel of different bristles against canvas. I selected a basic palette of colors: titanium white, ivory black, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, burnt umber, the essentials from which almost any color could be mixed. The canvas was the hardest choice. Too small, and I'd feel constrained. Too large, and I might feel overwhelmed. I finally settled on a modest 16 by 20-inch canvas, primed and ready, full of potential, starting a new project. Asked the clerk as she rang up my purchases. "Starting an old project," I said, "one I should have finished 30 years ago." That evening, I set up my easel by the window in my new studio, arranging my supplies on the small table beside it. The canvas sat blank and waiting, and for a moment I felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety. What if I'd lost whatever skill I'd once had? What if the paintings that emerged were terrible? What if I'd romanticized my own abilities during the long years away from art? But then I remembered something Grace had said the night before. "This isn't just about art, dear. This is about reclaiming yourself." I didn't need to create a masterpiece. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I just needed to begin. I squeezed paint onto my palette, mixed a warm grey for underpainting, and picked up a brush. The weight of it felt familiar, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. I loaded the brush with paint and touched it to the canvas, making the first mark I'd made as an artist in 30 years. It was just a line, barely an inch long, but it felt like the most important line I'd ever drawn. It was the line between who I'd been and who I was becoming, between the life I'd accepted and the life I was choosing to create. Outside my window, the evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the garden where I'd planted bulbs that would bloom in the spring. Tomorrow, I would continue painting. Tomorrow, I would continue becoming the person I'd always been underneath all the roles I'd played for other people. But tonight, I simply stood in my studio, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and the possibility of all the art yet to be created, and felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years, the deep satisfaction of doing exactly what I wanted to do. Exactly when I wanted to do it, for no reason other than because it fed my soul. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, just as I was finishing a painting of the mountains visible from my studio window. 3 weeks of daily painting had returned a fluidity to my hands that surprised me. Muscle memory, apparently, was more resilient than I'd imagined. The caller ID showed Eldric's number, the first time he'd contacted me directly since I'd sent the email declining to help with his insurance. Imogen, his voice was strained, different somehow. I need to see you, in person, today, if possible. What's wrong? Oh, I'm at the hospital, Mission Hospital. I'm in the emergency room. My chest tightened despite everything. What happened? Are you all right? I had chest pains last night. Amara drove me here around 3 in the morning. They're saying I need the surgery now, not in a few weeks. Something about the blockages being worse than they thought. I set down my brush, trying to process this information through the lens of what Nico had told me about Eldric's tendency to manipulate the urgency of his situation. What exactly are the doctors saying? They want to do it tomorrow morning, emergency bypass surgery. But without insurance, they're talking about transferring me to a county hospital. And I don't think ... double quotes, his voice broke slightly. I don't think I can survive a transfer right now. Eldric, slow down. Are you alone? Amara's here, but she's not handling this well. She keeps crying and asking me what she's supposed to do if something happens to me. I need someone who can think clearly, who can help me figure out what my options are. And there it was again, the automatic assumption that I would drop everything to manage his crisis. Even now, even after months of separation and clear boundaries, his first instinct was to call me when he needed someone competent to handle the practical details of his life. Have you spoken to the financial counselor? I asked. Yes, but they're talking about payment plans that would bankrupt me, or medical loans with interest rates that are basically criminal. Imogen, I know I have no right to ask this, but I bet you're going to ask anyway. I'm scared. I'm really, genuinely scared that I might die, and not because of the surgery, but because I can't afford the kind of care I need to survive it. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pull of his need, the trained response to fix his problems that had shaped 3 decades of my life. Where's Amara now? In the cafeteria. I sent her to get coffee because she was hyperventilating and the nurses were getting concerned about her. And your family? Have you called your brother? He doesn't have that kind of money. Neither does Mom. Imogen, you're the only person I know who has access to insurance that could cover this. The only person, after 30 years of marriage, after building a shared life and shared resources, after all the friends and business connections and extended family we'd accumulated together, I was the only person he could think of to solve this problem. It said something profound about the nature of our relationship, about who had been the safety net and who had been the risk taker, about who had built practical foundations and who had built castles in the air. I need to see the actual medical information, I said finally, not your interpretation of it, but what the doctors are actually saying. Can you arrange that? You'll come. I'll come to the hospital. I'll talk to your medical team. But I'm not making any promises about anything else. Thank you. Room 314 in the cardiac unit. The drive to Mission Hospital took 20 minutes through downtown Asheville, past the gallery district where Odette's space was located, past the coffee shops and bookstores and craft breweries that made the city feel alive with possibility. I'd been avoiding this part of town since the separation, not wanting to risk running into Eldric and Amara. But now I was driving directly toward them with no clear plan for what I would or wouldn't do when I got there. The cardiac unit was quiet, except for the electronic beeping of monitors and the soft-soled footsteps of nurses moving between rooms. I found room 314 and paused outside the door, steeling myself for whatever I was about to walk into. Eldric was in bed, hooked up to monitors, looking older and greyer than he had just weeks ago when he'd appeared on my doorstep asking for help. Amara sat in the bedside chair, still in the clothes she'd presumably been wearing when they'd rushed to the hospital hours earlier, her makeup smeared and her usually perfect hair falling limply around her face. "Imogen," Eldric said when he saw me, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Thank you for coming." Amara looked up, and I saw something I hadn't expected in her expression: genuine gratitude, rather than the entitled expectation I'd encountered. "At my workplace, thank you," she said quietly. "I know we don't have any right to ask for your help, but I'm so glad you're here." "I'm here to get information," I said carefully, "not to make decisions." Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiologist, was a woman about my age with the kind of calm competence I associated with people who regularly made life and death decisions. She explained the situation clearly and without drama. Eldric's condition had deteriorated more rapidly than expected, likely due to stress and poor lifestyle choices. The surgery was necessary and should happen soon, but soon meant within the next few days. Not within the next few hours. "What about the transfer to county hospital?" I asked. "That's a financial decision, not a medical one," Dr. Williams said. "The cardiac surgery team at the county hospital is excellent. The facilities are older and the wait times are longer, but the quality of care is comparable. So he wouldn't die from being transferred, not from the transfer itself, no. The county hospital would stabilize him and schedule the surgery within a reasonable time frame." After Dr. Williams left, I sat with Eldric and Amara in the uncomfortable silence of a hospital room where difficult truths couldn't be avoided. Eldric looked genuinely ill-pale and fragile in a way that reminded me he was almost 60, that his body was no longer the strong, resilient thing it had been when we were young. But he also looked embarrassed, like a man who'd been caught, exaggerating to get what he wanted and now had to face the consequences of his manipulation. "So," I said finally, "the emergency transfer story was an exaggeration. The doctor said it was urgent **. Urgent within a few days, not urgent within a few hours." "There's a difference, Eldric." Amara looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrent she didn't fully understand. "What does that mean?" "It means your fiancé has a tendency to present information in whatever way he thinks will get him what he wants," I said. "Even when he's talking to people who are trying to help him." "That's not fair," Eldric started, "isn't it? You told me this surgery was immediately necessary when it wasn't. You let me think you might die without my help when the actual risk was inconvenience and financial hardship. And now you've created a crisis atmosphere to pressure me into making a decision based on fear rather than facts." Amara was staring at Eldric with a new expression, not anger, exactly, but a kind of dawning awareness that the man she'd fallen in love with might be more complicated than she'd realized. "I was scared," Eldric said defensively. "I'm scared. When you're facing major surgery, a few days feels like emergency level urgent. And that's understandable," I said. "But it doesn't justify manipulating people who care about you." The word care hung in the air, and I realized I'd admitted something I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. Despite everything, the betrayal, the abandonment, the months of hurt and anger and slow healing, I did still care about Eldric. Not as a wife, not as someone who wanted him back, but as someone who'd shared 30 years of life with him and didn't want to see him suffer unnecessarily. But caring about someone's well-being and taking responsibility for their problems were two different things. I spoke to the financial counselor, While I was waiting for Dr. Williams, I said. There are options, medical loans, payment plans, even charitable foundations that help people in situations like this. None of them are as convenient as insurance, but all of them are possible. The interest rates are high but manageable if you're willing to make sacrifices and live more modestly than you'd planned. I looked at Amara, who was still processing everything she'd heard. There's also the option of you getting married immediately and adding Eldric to your insurance. My insurance doesn't cover pre-existing conditions, she said quietly. Then you could get a job with better benefits. Target is hiring for the holidays, and they offer health insurance to part-time employees after 90 days. Both Eldric and Amara stared at me as if I'd suggested they solve their problems by moving to Mars. Target, Amara said faintly, or any number of other retailers. The point is, there are solutions to this problem that don't involve me. They require effort and compromise and probably some lifestyle adjustments, but they exist. You're asking me to work retail. Amara's voice had taken on a tone of disbelief. I'm pointing out that people facing medical crises often have to make temporary sacrifices to get the care they need. Lots of people work retail. Lots of people take jobs they don't love to get health insurance. It's not the end of the world. The silence that followed was heavy with realizations none of us particularly wanted to face. Eldric was confronting the possibility that his new life might require actual work and sacrifice rather than just romantic passion. Amara was discovering that love might not be enough to solve practical problems. And I was understanding that my power in this situation came not from my ability to rescue them, but from my willingness to let them rescue themselves. So that's it, Eldric asked finally. You're just going to let me figure this out on my own? I'm going to let you figure this out like the capable adult you are, with the resources and options available to you. But we were married for 30 years, and you ended that marriage. You don't get to invoke it now when it's convenient for you. Amara spoke up suddenly, her voice small but clear. Maybe we should get married, like, actually married. This week, Eldric turned to look at her, and I saw something complicated pass across his face: surprise, relief, but also a kind of resignation that suggested this wasn't how he'd imagined proposing or being proposed to. Your insurance won't cover pre-existing conditions, he said. No, but maybe we could figure out something else. Apply for emergency Medicaid, or find a church that has a benevolence fund, or start a GoFund page. People do things like that all the time. I watched this exchange with fascination, seeing the moment when a relationship shifts from romance to partnership, from fantasy to the hard work of building a life together. It wasn't pretty or romantic, but it was real in a way their relationship apparently hadn't been before. That's actually not a bad plan, I said. Emergency Medicaid, charitable organizations, community fundraising. People facing medical crises use all of those resources regularly. You'd really rather see us scramble and stress and beg for charity than just help us yourself. Eldric's voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment. I'd rather see you handle your own problems like adults in a committed relationship instead of expecting your ex-wife to solve them for you. I stood up, gathering my purse and jacket. I hope the surgery goes well, Eldric. I really do, and I hope you and Amara find a way through this that makes you both stronger. Where are you going? Amara asked. Home. I have a painting to finish. As I walked toward the door, Eldric called after me. Imogen, wait. I need to say something. I turned back, curious despite myself. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice was different now, not manipulative or calculated, but genuinely contrite. Not just about the insurance thing, but about everything. About the way I left, the way I've treated you, the way I've expected you to keep fixing my problems even after I chose someone else. You deserve better than that. You deserve better than me. It was the apology I'd been waiting for without realizing it. not because I needed it to forgive him, but because I needed it to confirm that my perceptions of our marriage had been accurate. Thank you, I said simply. That means something to me. Does it mean enough for you too? No, I said gently, it doesn't. But it means I can walk away from this feeling good about who I am and who I'm becoming. I left them there in the sterile hospital room, surrounded by the electronic sounds of medical equipment and the weight of decisions they'd have to make together. As I walked through the corridors toward the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't expected, lightness. Not relief, exactly, but the particular freedom that comes from being true to yourself, even when it's difficult. In the car, I called Odette. How did it go? She asked when I told her where I'd been. Exactly the way it needed to go. They'll figure something out, and it won't involve me. And how does that feel? I thought about the question as I drove through downtown Asheville, past the gallery district and the coffee shops, toward home and the unfinished painting waiting in my studio. Like I finally learned the difference between being helpful and being used, I said. Like I finally figured out that my job is to live my own life, not to make everyone else's life easier. Hallelujah and amen. So, what's next? I'm going home to paint, and then I'm going to start planning my first art show in 30 years. Spring came early to Asheville that year, arriving in mid-March with a suddenness that caught everyone off guard. I was in my studio, working on a series of paintings I'd decided to call Reclaimed Landscapes, familiar mountain vistas painted from the perspective of someone who was seeing them with new eyes. The morning light was perfect, streaming through the north-facing window and illuminating the canvas in front of me with the kind of clarity that made every colour sing dart. It had been 5 months since the hospital confrontation with Eldric and Amara, and the distance of time had given me perspective on that final conversation. Eldric had had his surgery at the county hospital, funded by a combination of emergency Medicaid, a church benevolence fund, and a GoFund page that had raised enough money to cover the remaining costs. He'd made a full recovery, according to Nicor, and had married Amara in a small ceremony while he was still in cardiac rehabilitation. I'd sent them a card congratulating them on their marriage and wishing Eldric well with his recovery. It felt like the right thing to do, not because I owed them anything, but because holding on to anger would have damaged me more than it damaged them. The phone rang as I was mixing a particularly challenging shade of blue-green for the distant mountains in my current painting. It was Odette, calling from her gallery downtown. Are you sitting down? She asked without preamble. I'm standing at my easel, actually. Why? Because I just got off the phone with Ilana Vasquez, you remember, the artist whose opening you came to in November. She's curating a group show for the Asheville Art Museum, and she wants to include 3 of your paintings. I set down my brush and gripped the phone tighter. What? You heard me correctly. Ilana saw your work at my gallery last month when you weren't looking, and she's been thinking about it ever since. She called this morning to ask if you'd be interested in being part of a show called Late Bloomers, artists who are having their first major exhibitions after age 50. I sank into the chair I kept by the window, feeling slightly dizzy. Are you serious? Dead serious? The show opens in June, which gives us about 3 months to select and frame your pieces. Ilana specifically mentioned the mountain series you've been working on. She called them luminous and deeply personal, her exact words. After we hung up, I sat in my studio for a long time, looking at the paintings that covered the walls. In the 6 months since I'd assembled the easel, I'd completed more than 20 pieces, landscapes, still lifes, and a few portraits of the women from the quilting circle who'd been willing to sit for me. The work wasn't perfect, but it was honest, infused with the particular perspective that comes from having lived long enough to understand what really matters. That afternoon, I drove to the elementary school to share the news with Clara, who'd become one of my closest friends during the months of rebuilding my life. I found her in her office, working on reports with the focused concentration that made her so good at her job. I have news, I said, knocking on her open door. She looked up with a smile. Good news, I hope. You're glowing. I told her about the museum show, watching her expression shift from surprise to delight to something that looked like pride. Imogen, that's incredible. Your first museum exhibition. I keep thinking I should be more excited, but mostly I feel amazed. Like, how did I get here from where I was a year ago? One choice at a time, Clara said. One boundary at a time, one painting at a time. That evening, the quilting circle gathered at my house for our monthly potluck dinner, a tradition we'd started in January when the library's community room had been closed for renovations. I waited until after we'd eaten to share my news, watching their faces light up with the particular joy that comes from seeing someone you care about succeed. Well, it's about time, Grace said with characteristic directness. I've been wondering when the rest of the world would catch up to what we already knew about your talent. I want to commission a piece, said Sarah immediately. Something for my daughter's new house. She's been looking for artwork that has meaning behind it, not just something that matches the couch. Me too, added Betty. I'd love a painting of my grandmother's garden if you're willing to work from old photographs. Dolores, ever practical, was already thinking about the business aspects. You'll need to raise your prices once you're a museum exhibited artist. Don't undervalue your work just because you're grateful for the opportunity. The conversation continued. Late into the evening, these women who'd supported me through the worst months of my life, now celebrating what felt like the beginning of something entirely new. When they finally left, the house felt full of possibility in a way it hadn't since before my marriage started falling apart. On Sunday, I called Nico to share the news. Mom, that's amazing. His enthusiasm was immediate and infectious. I want to fly out for the opening if that's okay with you. More than okay. I'd love to have you there. And Mom, I have some news too. Jessica and I are engaged. Jessica was the woman he'd been dating for the past 2 years, a sous chef at a restaurant in Portland's Pearl District who shared his passion for sustainable cooking and his quiet, thoughtful approach to life. Oh, honey, that's wonderful. When? Last weekend. We went hiking on Mount Hood, and I proposed at sunrise. Very romantic, very us. We're thinking about a small wedding this fall. Maybe in October when the leaves are changing. I'm so happy for you both. Thanks. And Mom? Jessica specifically asked me to tell you that she's excited to meet the woman who raised such a good man. I think you'll really like her. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my morning coffee, thinking about the strange ways life circles back on itself. A year ago, I'd been a woman whose husband had left her for someone else, whose sense of identity had been so wrapped up in being half of a couple that she'd almost disappeared entirely. Now I was an artist preparing for her first museum exhibition, a woman who'd learned to put her own needs first, a mother whose son was choosing a partner based on love and compatibility rather than just passion. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, it had been the accumulation of small choices. Daily decisions to honor my own needs and boundaries, gradual steps toward becoming the person I'd always been underneath all the roles I'd played for other people. There was a knock at the door around noon, and I opened it to find my Tulliver standing on my porch with a small bouquet of daffodils from his church's garden. Odette told me about the museum show, he said with his characteristic shy smile. I wanted to congratulate you in person. May and I had been seeing each other casually since January, a relationship that had grown slowly from shared interest to genuine affection. He was nothing like Eldric quiet, where Eldric had been dramatic, steady where Eldric had been mercurial, entrusted in my thoughts and feelings in a way that felt revolutionary after 30 years of being with someone who'd rarely asked what I wanted. Thank you, I said, accepting the flowers. They're beautiful. Would you like some coffee? We sat on my front porch swing, watching the neighborhood come alive with the particular energy of a beautiful spring day. Mrs. Chen was working in her garden, and she waved when she saw us, calling out congratulations on the art show news. Travel fast in our small community. How does it feel? May asked, knowing your work will be in a museum. Surreal, wonderful, a little terrifying. Like I'm finally becoming who I was supposed to be all along. I think that's exactly what's happening. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself thinking about the difference between this relationship and my marriage. With Eldric, even the quiet moments have been charged with unspoken expectations, things I should be doing, ways I should be thinking about his needs, adjustments I should be making to keep our life running smoothly. With May, the silence was actually peaceful, a shared space where I could simply be myself without performance or calculation. I have something to ask you, I said finally. Anything. Would you like to be my date to the museum opening? It's going to be fancy and probably a little overwhelming, and I'd love to have someone there who knows me as I am now, not as who I used to be. His smile was immediate and warm. I'd be honored. That afternoon, I drove to the art supply store to buy materials for the final paintings I wanted to include in the museum show. The owner, a woman named Patricia who'd become a friend over the months of regular visits, greeted me with enthusiasm when she heard about the exhibition. I've been watching you rediscover your artistic voice, she said, as she helped me select canvas and brushes. It's been beautiful to witness. You've gone from someone who was apologetic about taking up space to someone who knows exactly what she wants to create. I feel like I'm still figuring it out. That's the beautiful part. The figuring out, the discovering, the constant growth. That's what keeps art alive. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my studio, working on a new painting, a self-portrait, something I'd never attempted before. Not because I was particularly interested in my own face, but because I wanted to capture something I'd never seen in my own eyes before. The look of a woman who knew her own worth. The painting was challenging, in ways I hadn't expected. Every time I thought I'd capture the right expression, I'd step back and realize I was still painting the woman I used to be, the one who tried to make herself smaller, more agreeable, less demanding of space and attention. But gradually, layer by layer, the woman I was becoming started to emerge on the canvas. She had the same face, the same graying hair, the same lines around her eyes. But there was something different in her expression, a quiet confidence, a sense of self-possession that came from having learned to trust her own judgment about what she needed and wanted. Evening was falling by the time I finished the underpainting, and I stepped back to evaluate what I'd created. It wasn't complete. It would take several more sessions to build up the layers of color and detail that would bring it to life, but I could already see that it was going to be something good. Something true. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Imogen, this is Amara. I hope it's okay that I'm contacting you. Eldric, and I wanted you to know that he's doing well after the surgery. And we're both grateful for the way you handled everything at the hospital. You taught us something important about taking responsibility for our own lives. Thank you. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. I'm glad to hear Eldric is doing well. Best wishes to you both. It was a small exchange, but it felt like the final piece of closure I'd needed. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd all learned something from the difficult months of separation and redefinition. As I cleaned my brushes and prepared to close the studio for the day, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a woman who believed her worth came from how useful she was to other people. Now I was an artist preparing for her first museum exhibition, a woman who'd learned to put her own needs first. A person who discovered that saying no to what diminished her made room for what nourished her. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights of doubt, moments of loneliness, Days when I'd questioned whether choosing myself over everyone else's expectations was selfish or necessary. But sitting in my studio surrounded by paintings that reflected my own vision, my own voice, my own way of seeing the world, I knew I'd made the right choice. I was no longer the supporting character in other people's stories. I was the artist of my own life, creating something beautiful and meaningful from the raw materials of experience, choice, and hard-won wisdom. The museum opening was still 3 months away, but I was already imagining the moment when people would see my work and understand something about what it meant to bloom late but bloom fully. To discover at 59 that it's never too late to become who you're always meant to be. Outside my studio window, the spring evening was settling over Asheville with the particular beauty that had drawn artists to these mountains for generations. Tomorrow, I would start a new painting. Tomorrow, I would continue the work of creating the life I'd always wanted, but had never dared to claim. But tonight, I simply stood in my studio surrounded by canvases that told the story of my transformation. Grateful for every choice that had brought me to this moment of becoming exactly who I was meant to be. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.